That was a long time ago. My daughters often remind me. As a matter of fact, my youngest Bailey, she said to me not too long ago. She says, "Daddy, when you played, did they have face masks?" And the kids, they put you in your place often, and believe me, they never really give me much leeway. So that was, man, that was almost grainy, Godfrey. That was just amazing, but that takes you back a long way. Through the magic of technology, I want to welcome the Fry Road campus joining us this morning as well, and thank you for having me with you guys. I'm going to be brief. I've only got about 20 minutes or so. So with your permission, I'm going to dive right in and get to the heart of the matter. I want to talk about hope. Godfrey talked about that as an introduction. Specifically, I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we go about producing hope in the organization that I'm involved with called Lift Up America, and in particular, the Ambassadors of Compassion program that we have. This generation is challenged. In our nation's 238-plus-year history, this will be the first generation that will not eclipse their parents in terms of economic mobility. That is, moving from one socioeconomic quintile to the next as a matter of course. Most of us in this audience expected to do better than our parents, and we in fact did. But for myriad reasons, some of which we'll unpack over the next 19 minutes or so, this generation will not do that. And there are implications to that, and there are attitudes and mindsets that we must develop and flesh out if we're going to be able to collaborate and compete on a global scale. So we're going to start out providing some compelling evidence that there is a need for hope in this regard, and we'll unpack how some of the effective engagement techniques, if you will, that Christ even used. I was intrigued by the methodology that he used, and I found out that he always approached people based on their physical needs first. I mean, if somebody was hungry, it's kind of hard to talk to them about spiritual weighty matters if they were starving. So he met their physical needs, and then their emotional needs, and then their spiritual needs. Not necessarily to suggest that one is more important than the other, but it's clearly we know that eternity is the most important thing. But people are able to listen a lot more when you deal with their physical needs first, and they can hear you. So the methodology of Christ is actually the same methodology that we use with respect to the Ambassadors of Compassion program. And it's really, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, it's really all about love. At the end of the day, if you love someone or if you care about a set of circumstances or values enough, come hell or high water, you'll do whatever it takes to make sure you affect the kind of change that brings about positive outcomes. Lift Up America and the Ambassadors of Compassion Leadership Program, people ask me to define what it's all about. I tell them that we are dealers in hope. We're experts at creating what I call conception moments. When individuals or organizations decide to do whatever, you name it, you insert whatever objective you want to accomplish in life, we create and sustain those moments through a sometimes 14 or 19-week period in this Ambassadors of Compassion program. But it goes well beyond that. In many cases, the program is that catalytic event that changes the course of a student's life. And they're able to make sense of the world in a manner in which those who are not exposed to this type of training simply cannot. And as Godfrey and I were sharing before we came in this morning, it kind of encapsulated and reminded me of a statement that Malcolm Gladwell made in his book Outliers. And he talked about the reasons for why we succeed. And he said that the tallest oak in the forest is not the tallest merely because it came from the hardiest acorn, but it's also the tallest because no other trees blocked its sunlight. The soil around it was deep and rich. No squirrel chewed through its bark as a sapling, and no lumberjack cut it down before it had a chance to fully mature. And that's what we're in the business of doing, protecting our youth, but yet being clear-minded and clear-headed and articulating a narrative that speaks to the challenges in a very real sense, not placating them, not giving them a false sense of security. The world is a very much different place than when you and I grew up. So I want to pause here a moment for a point of emphasis because, we equip them with the skills and confidence they need to be successful in navigating an increasingly competitive life context. And we do this largely through this kind of communal and personal relationships through trained adults. Our teachers and mentors are the keys to what we do. And our kids win and the teachers win because they understand what I call the all-important why factor. Good mentors and good teachers, good fathers, good mothers, good companies know how to do things. But the truly great ones know why they do what they do. Mandela, Dr. King, and all the great freedom riders understood this narrative was almost plain in their minds as they endured Selma, the Birmingham jail, and all those touch points along that freedom run through their era. And so this narrative plays when you're in that dark place in that dreary night, and it sustains you. I believe what the Word of God says, as the sun and rain comes down from heaven and waters the seed and causes it to bring forth after its own kind, so shall my word be. The word, will not return void until it has achieved the purpose unto which it was sent. My missionary mother would sit me on her lap and she would articulate the narrative behind that and the meaning. She would say, and she would call me Pimpy. That was my nickname, Pimpy. She said, Pimpy, you know what that means? And I said, no, ma'am. She said, you need to understand that God has so arranged the affairs of nature that if you take a seed and you put it in the ground and you water it and you nurture it and the sun kisses it, the seed really has no choice in the equation. It must do what God has destined it to do. And he then says, so shall my word be. The word, will not, it cannot return void until it has achieved the purpose unto which it was sent. And that has great implications as we play out our program in cities across America. So again, I said that our mentors and teachers of the organizations are really the key. Now, people say, well, what is the secret sauce of what you're doing? Now, kind of move into a little bit of different space here, and then I'm going to quickly dovetail into the core of it by virtue of some slides that I want to share with you. The secret sauce is that our strategies and our methodologies are really rooted in this, and this is a kind of a fancy word, but it has actually spiritual origins. Behavioral economics-based analytics. What does that mean, okay? Well, we know, for example, why kids drop out. We worked hand in hand with Gallup to figure out why that reason is. And you may be surprised to know that it has very little to do with gangs. It has very little to do with needing to drop out to work because the family can't make enough money. Those may be attendant parts of the overall narrative, but the number one reason, the causal factor behind why kids drop out of school, 30% do in this nation, which is a huge number, is because they lose hope. Hopelessness is the reason why kids drop out of school. And from that understanding, all strategies, all solutions that are deployed to solve the problem should be born with that background. It's kind of like a quarterback that comes to the line of scrimmage of his circumstance. The first thing the quarterback is trying to do is identify where the threats are. By alignment, a good quarterback knows, even though they may be trying to give him an illusion or a false sense of what they're trying to do, a good quarterback that studied the film, that's discerned and looked over time at the circumstances, will be able to say, that's where the threat is coming from. And as a result of discerning properly what the threat is, he can call a play or a series of plays, depending on what the context of the game is, that gives him the best chance to succeed against that perceived threat. And then ultimately, it's about executing that play. So it's a 1, 2, 3-step process. Discern the threat, call a play or a series of plays that give you the best chance to succeed against that threat, and then execute that play every single day. So the research is clear on why we do what we do. And so when you hear in the coming months and the coming days about Lift Up America and the Ambassadors of Compassion program, you'll know a little bit more about it. In essence, what we're trying to do is equip our kids to be able to compete in these places that I call red zone. So you ask the question, well, what is a red zone? The red zone is that fiercely defended territory between the 20-yard line and the goal line. You've all heard about the red zone. I see the young lady back there in the back. She's nodding her head. She knows what a red zone is. So we know about the red zone, so we don't have to spend a lot of time unpacking that. But see, there's some things about the red zone we need to understand. The red zone is a constricted space, and scoring in this place becomes very, very difficult for a number of reasons. And I want to go into all of them. Just suffice it to say that from 6,500 square yards, it's reduced down to 1,300. Nearly half of your playbook goes out of the window because the defense doesn't have to defend the deep pass anymore. So they can bring their defenders closer to the line of scrimmage, which makes executing, running plays more difficult than ever before. So you and I are in a red zone, and particularly our young kids are in a red zone. And so let me kind of walk through you and kind of tell you exactly what a red zone is. Let me give you a working definition. You know you're in a red zone when the need to achieve an objective is immediate, the obstacles between you and those objectives are formidable, the options available to us are limited, and time is running out. Now let me unpack one quick thing for you to kind of give you a nugget of where this generation is. When I was growing up, there was roughly 290 or so million people in America. And that was our purview. That was the competition pool who we worked against. Well, as Carl Sagan would say, today you've got billions and billions and billions, for those of you old enough to know who Carl Sagan is. Billions and billions and billions of people who you're competing against. Even in America, there's 360 million here. But driving it all is information technology, which allows people in Bangalore, India, and China to collaborate and compete for opportunities that they couldn't even think about competing for just 15, 20 years ago. So the context has changed dramatically. The average person is going to have between 7 and 11 jobs before they reach, quote unquote, retirement age, whatever that is these days. That has implications to it. So the process of educating kids to the context of their time, like the quarterback who comes to the line of scrimmage, is the province of leadership. We need to, as parents and folks, to discern what's happening out here and to communicate a strategy and methodologies and plans and approaches to effectively deal with that. Okay? That's what it means. So now, since we're in the context of church, real quickly, I want to play something for you, and I want you to listen. And let's engage one another. And I want you to tell me if you understand, if you hear, if you can identify with this individual in Scripture, a lesser-known figure who found himself in a red zone. Take a listen to this.
11, the 20th year, while I was in the citadel city of Susha, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven.
Who was that? Nehemiah, right? A classic red zone scenario that's relevant all these years later. Here he is sitting in the citadel city of Susha, managed to work his way up to this high position. Remember now, he was a glorified butler, but he was more than that. Everything that went before the king had to pass through him before it got to the king, Artaxerxes. His brother Hanani comes and says, hey brother, the city that we grew up in, the gates and walls have been destroyed. And what Nehemiah did, and you know the narrative, you're familiar with it, his efforts ultimately ended in an unprecedented run of success in Israel's history because he was willing to go before the king and ask him for a couple of things. Protection, first of all, permission, protection and provision. Asaph, who was overseeing the royal force, gave him everything that he needed. He got a writ to pass through the Trans-Euphrates, which was a very dangerous proposition at the time, and he had the faith and courage enough, moved by his faith of his conviction, to ask the king in the first place. Those three things, he came to the line of scrimmage of his circumstances and said, I've got to do something about it. He didn't have a choice in the matter. It was a core value. And how do you know it was a core value? Because of what he did. Core values are what you do, not what you say. So again, whether it's centuries ago or whether it's here in 2013, 2014 now, it doesn't matter. We are going to find ourselves in red zone scenarios, and today where we are is one of the most unprecedented times, again, in our nation's 238-year history. So with the last 3 minutes here, I want to unpack a couple of things. And I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I think this is the most relevant part of what I have to share with you. There are three things that I would suggest to you as we approach this Ambassadors of Compassion period that we're going to be working on. First one is understanding that the will is the single most important aspect of human personality. Why? Because once it becomes fixed, it becomes almost impossible to change. I'll give you a quick story to illustrate this. Some months ago, I am working out at LA Fitness. I get through working out, and there's this kid at Subway where I wanted to grab a Subway sandwich. And I go in, before I get in, I come up and he sees my lights on my car, and he darts behind the partition area that was separating the area where he was cleaning and where he was working. Now remember, this is 9:30 at night, they close at 10 o'clock. He doesn't want to make me a sandwich. I figured that out really quickly. So I want to turn this into a white paper. Now again, remember, the context is the will, and once it becomes fixed, it's almost impossible to change. So I'm sitting there, and I said, this is interesting. So I got out a little piece of paper, and I waited till about 2 minutes to the top of the hour. And I got out of my car, and I went and I tapped on the window, and by then he's coming back out because now he's in a tenable position to say, we're closed. And that's exactly what he said. And I mouthed at him. I said, would you make me a sandwich? And he did indeed, said, we're closed. I said, great. Got in my car, went home, got on the internet, and saw that there were 37,000 subways in the United States of America and on military bases across the world. Quickly, I did the quick math. $185,000 was that decision moment if every one of those millennials working in that subway decided to make me a sandwich in that moment. Now, you say that that's interesting, but what kind of big impact does it have? Well, you and I have between 10 and 20,000 decision moments in the course of the day. Most of them are inconsequential, whether you use salt or pepper on food or whatever, to sit in this seat or that seat. But there are usually 2 or 3 of them that has major consequences or impact economically. To pay a bill, maybe to buy a big ticket purchase item like a computer perhaps. The aggregate of all of that literally has the capacity to move gross domestic, and that's the takeaway. But the problem is once the will gets fixed, it's almost impossible to change it. It takes an intentional and concerted effort to take this aspect of human personality that is not necessarily in and of itself bad. It's the influences around us that allow us to attach itself to a core value, and then ultimately we make decisions based on that. This entire generation tends to think more like that young man than they did in any point in time in our nation's history. And that is a major problem. It has great implications. So once the will becomes fixed, and it's not so much a principle as much as it is being aware of the fact of human personality. So if you have an entire generation that thinks this way, and there are myriad reasons behind why they do, but make no mistake about it, they do by and large tend to think that way. We need to be aware of that and then approach them as the AOC Ambassadors of Compassion program does, and we manage them accordingly. Really quickly, the vector sum of focus. If you happen to be writing, the vector sum of focus is really simple. V-E-C-T-O-R, vector, the speed and distance of an object as it moves toward its destination. An airplane starts from Houston. I go to New York every week. We take a course. That course is called a vector. V stands for values. Values determine the object of our focus. Okay? Straightforward, simple enough. E is energies. Our energy, if it's properly aligned with our core value, my wife doesn't have to coerce me to do anything that I value. If you want to talk about football, she'll talk about football all day. She'll listen to me talk about it because she knows I'm passionate about it. You name it, you plug it in. What are you passionate about? Your energy will naturally flow if it's attached to your core value. Values determine the object of our focus, and energy will naturally flow out of that. V-E-C-T, courage, not the absence of fear. Nelson Mandela had it. But it's the presence of it, but the willingness to move ahead anyway despite it. We need courage to succeed. T, talent. Everybody has to have an appreciable amount of talent, particularly our young people, if they're going to compete in this increasingly competitive context. The Ambassadors of Compassion program helps them develop that. O, organization, the ability to reduce chaos from entering your daily processes. Whatever it is that you're doing, if you're not organized, you don't have a chance of being successful. And then finally, resources. We all have to have resources to do what we do. And lastly, the principle of creativity and destruction. And I'll end with this comment. The principle of creativity and destruction is straightforward. Probably the greatest example in our time would be the Twin Towers in New York City. Those Twin Towers took 6.5 years from conception to the building of the second tower, all right? They came down in less than 109 minutes. What's the principle? Creative processes, building lives, building companies, building young people, inherently take longer than destructive processes do. But you can't stop there. It's one thing to have cognitive understanding of those facts. It's another thing altogether to have a behavioral transformation. That is to say, the truth of the principle dictates where I go, who I associate with, what I do, and all of those things. It's critical that we understand that. So these are the type of principles and concepts, so-called soft leadership skills, that we teach in the Ambassadors of Compassion program, and it allows our youngsters to be able to make sense of the world in a way in which they simply could not. I'll end with this thought. Dr. Martin Luther King, in our presence and in my consciousness all the time, I remember his words as if it was yesterday, and we've made such great progress on many fronts regarding the fight for freedom and equality and justice across the board. When I was a kid, I used to listen to those tapes and I would commit it to memory because they were like words. They were powerful, and that was fused in my mind a long time ago that words had the ability to transform. And I can hear him saying that centuries ago, the prophet Jeremiah raised an interesting question. He looked out and saw the wicked people prospering and the good people suffering, and he cried out, "Is there no balm in Gilead that heals the sin-sick soul? Is there no balm in Gilead that makes the wounded whole?" Centuries later, Their forefathers and foresisters saw a similar plight. They had often nothing to look forward to but the sizzling heat and the rawhide whip of the overseer cracking down on their back. But they somehow were able to take Jeremiah's question and straighten it into an exclamation point and decided to sing, "There is a balm in Gilead that heals the sin-sick soul. There is a balm in Gilead that makes the wounded whole." And I want to thank you, my Americans, my fellow Americans, for the efforts and for the way this church in particular, in the great faith of Wesley, has embraced that narrative and lived it out daily. We have some ways to go, but we're getting better every single day. And evil may so shape events that Caesar would occupy the palace and Christ the cross, but one day, that same Christ would rise again and split history into AD and BC so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spencer. And you can see, folks, why I'm charged up. Because I've been meeting with folks from the NAACP, the pastors in our region, for several months, and we've seen issues that need to be resolved, of hopelessness and anger and so much among our poorest. And so we finally God brought us together, and I'm telling you, Ambassadors of Compassion is going to partner with I Hope to bring hope to the most at-risk kids in our junior and senior high. And you're going to hear more about it. But I am so thrilled. God is doing awesome things. Because we're faithful with little things, He will bring us to big things. And I want you to be in prayer about that. Thank you so very much. We're going to go share the word over in the Journey service as you continue to worship.